I never imagined a small medical alert sign could spark one of the most absurd battles of my life, but living in a neighborhood with an HOA president like Susan Harper can turn even the simplest accommodations into a full-blown war. I've been a resident of Pine View Heights for 5 years, a peaceful suburban enclave with manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and, unfortunately, the most controlling HOA president east of the Rockies. Susan, a woman in her mid-50s with a flawlessly styled brunette bob that seemed glued to her head much like her rigid opinions were glued to her character, roamed our streets in her spotless silver BMW, clipboard always in hand. She measured grass lengths and inspected holiday decorations with the intensity of a drill sergeant sizing up recruits. Most neighbors dodged her like a disease, DVYing behind bushes or faking urgent phone calls whenever her car crept into VW. For years I flew under Susan's radar until my doctor diagnosed me with a severe bee sting allergy. One sting could send me into anaphylactic shock in minutes. My doctor insisted I put up a discreet medical alert sign by my front door to alert emergency responders to my condition if I couldn't speak during a crisis. It was a modest red and white sign, no bigger than a standard sheet of paper, featuring a medical symbol and text noting that a resident with severe allergies lived here. I set it up on a Friday afternoon, positioning it near my entrance where it'd be noticeable to paramedics but wouldn't clash with the neighborhood's polished look. By Saturday morning, Susan came knocking literally. Her sharp raps jolted me out of a deep sleep. I opened the door to find her standing there, HOA rulebook pressed to her chest like a sacred relic, her face twisted with self-righteous fury. "Good morning," I said, forcing a polite tone despite the rude awakening. "Can I help you with something?" Susan jabbed a perfectly manicured finger at my sign. "That," she declared, her voice thick with authority, "violat Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines. No signs are allowed on residential properties except for security system notices and approved seasonal decor." She flipped open her rulebook with practiced ease and pointed to the rule in question. I took a steadying breath, determined to keep my cool. "Susan, this is a medical alert sign. It's not decorative or commercial, it's to let emergency responders know I have a serious condition. It could save my life." Her eyes narrowed as she sized me up. "You look fine to me," she said with a dismissive huff. "Rules are rules. That sign needs to be gone within 24 hours, or you'll face a $50 daily fine." My patience started to fray. "This isn't a yard sale ad or a political banner," I explained. "I could die from a bee sting. EMTs need to know that if I'm unconscious." Susan straightened even more if that was possible. "I don't see any bees buzzing around right now," she said with a smug little smile. "The guidelines are clear, no signs. If we bend the rules for you, soon everyone will want exceptions, and Pine View Heights will be a mess of signs and chaos." It's a slippery slope. I was floored. Was she seriously equating a life SAVYing sign with random clutter? "Susan, this is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a reasonable accommodation for my condition." Her smile grew more condescending. "The HOA guidelines override that for aesthetic reasons. You signed on to these rules when you moved here." She tapped her rulebook like a judge banging a gavel. "Take it down by tomorrow, or the fines start. Have a nice day." With that, she turned and strutted back to her BMW, leaving me stunned in my doorway. I didn't take the sign down. Instead, I spent Saturday digging into the legality of medical alert signs versus HOA restrictions. Everything I found backed me up. Federal law protected these signs, and no HOA could ban them. I printed out the key legal details and braced myself for Susan's next move. Sure enough, she returned Sunday morning. "The sign's still up," she said without preamble, already scribbling on her clipboard. "That's $50 for today, and it'll keep adding up until you comply." I handed her my prepared folder. "Susan, I've researched this. Inside, you'll find info on the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, both of which protect my right to the sign. Please take a look and rethink your stance." She barely glanced at it before shovying it back at me. "I don't need to read this. Our guidelines were crafted by the board's lawyer and are legally binding. Remove the sign or the fines stick." "I'm not taking down a sign that could save my life," I said firmly, "and I won't pay fines for exercising my federal rights." Susan's face reddened. "Listen, I don't know what kind of place you think this is, but in Pine View Heights we follow the rules. If you don't like it, maybe you should move somewhere more." She paused dramatically, "Suited to your special needs. The way she sneered special needs made it sound like I'd asked to park a tractor in my yard. I'm not MOVYing and the sign stays, I replied. You might want to check with the HOA's lawyer before issuing more baseless fines. We'll see about that, she snapped, storming off. I knew this wasn't the end. 2 days later, I came home from work to find my sign gone. In its place was a neon yellow violation notice in a plastic sleeve, stating the unauthorized sign had been removed by HOA management and that I now owed Dula $150 in fines. Apparently, garish notices didn't ruin the neighborhood's charm, but my discreet sign did. I was furious Susan had crossed into dangerous territory, risking my safety over her power trip. I called the HOA management company, only to learn Susan, as president, had the authority to remove violations. The rep sounded sorry but powerless. You'll have to bring it up at the next board meeting, she said. That was 3 weeks away, too long to wait with my health on the line. I contacted my housing law attorney instead. After hearing the story, he drafted a stern letter to the HOA board and Susan, detailing the illegality of their actions and demanding my sign's return. The letter went out the next day. That evening, Susan showed up with 2 board members in tow, her smile tight and victorious. Since you've escalated this with legal threats, she said, handing me another notice, the board has voted to raise the fine to Dula $200 daily, retroactive to the first violation. You now owe Dula $750. A lanky board member with a constant scowl added, we've also placed a lien on your property until this is settled. He avoided my gaze. Maybe not everyone was fully on board with Susan's vendetta. Where's my sign? I asked coolly. Disposed of as unauthorized material, Susan replied with a wave of her hand. You can request a variance at the next meeting, but they're rarely granted. Her smugness was palpable. She thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that I'd installed a doorbell camera after our first clash, capturing her removing my sign without notice or right. My attorney told me to replace the sign and document everything, so I did. The next day, I put up a new sign, adding a small legal note below it stating it was protected under federal disability law and that removal could trigger legal consequences. I also had my lawyer file a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development for Fair Housing Act violations. Susan had gone from petty tyrant to lawbreaker. 2 days later, I was gardening when Susan's BMW screeched up. She charged toward me, face twisted with rage. You replaced it? She shrieked. And what's this threatening note? Take it down now. I stood, glove still on. The sign stays, Susan. It's legally protected, and you know it. I'm the president of this HOA, she bellowed, as if that made her royalty. You'll follow our rules or face the consequences. What consequences? I asked calmly. More illegal fines? Another fake lien? Or will you trespass again to rip down a protected sign? Her face darkened. You're recording me, aren't you? She hissed, spotting my camera. That's a violation recording. The VYCES need architectural committee approval. I laughed. Security cameras are allowed under Section 15 of your precious rulebook. Maybe you should read it. That's when Susan lost it. In a fit of anger, she yanked my new sign off its post. There, she yelled, wavying it at me. Explain this to the board. Susan, I said evenly, you're on video stealing and breaking a federally protected sign. Put it back. Instead, she hurled it to the ground and stomped on it. Sue me, she taunted. The whole board's behind me. No one defies Susan Harper and Pine VYEW Heights. I pulled out my phone. Then I'm calling 911 to report theft and destruction of medical equipment. Her bravado faltered. You wouldn't, she said, but her voice wavered. I dialed, put it on speaker, and explained to the dispatcher. The HOA president had destroyed my VY-TAL medical sign. It was all on VY-DEO, and this came after legal warnings. Susan stammered, this is absurd, it's just a sign. The dispatcher cut in, ma'am, tampering with medical equipment can be reckless endangerment. Officers are on their way. Susan's confidence crumbled as I hung up. Being HOA president doesn't make you untouchable, I said. You've been told repeatedly this is illegal. Now you'll tell it to the police. Minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They watched the footage, inspected the broken sign, and took our statements. Susan insisted she was just enforcing rules, but the officers weren't buying it. Medical alert signs are legally protected, one said. You can't remove or destroy them, HOA or not. To her shock, they arrested her for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. As they read her rights, she sputtered, "You can't arrest me. I'm the Pine VY Heights HOA president. We've won landscaping awards." The officer shutting the car door replied, "Tell it to the judge, ma'am." As Susan was driven off, still ranting about curb appeal, neighbors emerged, sharing their own tales of her rain fines for slightly off color blinds or trash cans out a minute too long. The next day, the HOA president called to apologize. An emergency meeting had ousted Susan as president, dropped all my fines, and lifted the lien. She'd been bailed out but faced criminal charges in my CIVYL suit. 2 weeks later, in court, Susan was fined $5,000, ordered to pay my legal fees, and given 200 hours of community service for reckless endangerment, a misdemeanor on her record. "My real estate business," she sobbed, makeup streaking. "No one will hire an agent with a criminal record." The gavel fell, silencing her. For once, Susan Harper faced real consequences.